All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this week's webinar presentation. My name is Kathy Purdy. I'm the marketing manager here at Schoeneck King. Just two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address those as time allows. Once the webinar has ended, if you would take a moment to complete the survey, we would appreciate it, as we do share your suggestions for future topics with our presenters. So to start us off today, I'm going to hand it to Adam Mastroleo in our Syracuse office.
Kathy, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I feel like we say this every week, but we have a packed schedule for you. A lot of updates, a lot of new guidance, press conferences that we will try to decipher and interpret for you during the next 45 minutes or so. I also wanted to highlight a couple of things. The questions that you're putting in the chat, if we can get to them today, we certainly will, but I will let you know that we are continuing to do the grab bag segment. So I reviewed all the questions that have come in over the past couple of weeks to prepare for the grab bag today, and I know that Andy Bobrick will do that next week. So feel free to leave us questions in the chat. We'll get to them today if we can. If not, we'll try to get to them next week. So first, we are going to start with Kristen Warner. Kristen is an attorney in our Rochester office who practices primarily in school law. And Kristen is going to walk us through some of the issues that are facing school districts, including the recently released guidance from the state. I think it was released just yesterday. So Kristen, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Adam. Well, this weekend was one of chaos for most school districts. After a letter was released on Friday afternoon, the head of the DOH sent a letter to the CDC seeking an update on masking requirements in light of the conflicting statements with the CDC guidance on K through 12 schools and the more recent CDC guidance for youth camps. So Dr. Zucker was basically looking for a go-ahead from the CDC to remove the mask mandate for schools. And he insinuated that the mask mandate was going to be removed for everyone, regardless of vaccination status, though mask use would be strongly encouraged for unvaccinated folks. And they plan to have that effective Monday. This is released Friday afternoon. This, of course, caused a lot of anxiety and uncertainness as to what schools should do in light of Monday morning coming very quickly. And after it was made clear that the governor wasn't going to issue any more guidance over the weekend, the Commissioner of Education issued a statement saying that schools should continue the status quo. Masks should still be worn until further guidance was issued, because as of that moment, the only executive order was still mandating that schools have masks on. On Monday, the CDC finally did weigh in, saying that New York schools should still continue to require masks indoors due to the continued infection risk for unvaccinated children. And Governor Cuomo had a press conference where he informed us that masks would no longer be required outdoors. That mandate was being lifted, but they were still going to be required indoors for everyone. Schools are allowed to still maintain that kids wear masks outside. That's up to the districts, but they're no longer required to. So that's where that stands right now. So no more mask mandate outdoors, but there is still a mask mandate indoors. And as Katie pointed out in an email this weekend, Governor Cuomo made a very funny joke saying there was no confusion with the schools over this issue. But I think we actually know where we're standing right now on that. And as of, for now, it looks like it's going to continue this way for a little bit. For another issue we've been looking at are the gathering requirements for proms and graduations. There's been nothing really new. Schools are taking this two ways, we've been seeing. Some are requiring pre-registration for events like graduation, where people will fill out they'll provide their testing information, the negative testing information, or their vaccination information ahead of time and then picking up tickets to lessen the confusion on the day of. We're also seeing other districts using an attestation form where people will be, the day of graduation, allowed to swear that they've received their negative test or that they're vaccinated. We're still waiting for the state to update the specific prom and graduation guidance because it doesn't reflect the increased thresholds for other types of gatherings that have been updated, but the actual specific prom graduation one has not yet been updated. The other new thing that happened just yesterday is that the governor signed a law that amends some of the tenure requirement process, and it also waives the APPR requirements for the 2020-2021 school year. This had been done by executive order, and that expired May 27th. And the state, there was some confusion as to whether the governor had authority to do that through executive order. The state ed department was kind of implying that he didn't, so they were not exactly saying that that was enforceable, but now that it's been passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, it is in effect. This would allow teachers and principals who were appointed during the 2017-18, 2018-19, or 2019-20 school years to be eligible for tenure if they received an effective or a highly effective composite APPR rating in at least one of the past 4 years. Under normal circumstances, they would have to have received that during 3 of the past 4 years. But last year they did not do APPRs, and this amendment to the law also waives the school district's requirement to do that for the 2020-2021 school year as well. And the language that was included in the bill that just passed is pretty prohibitive. It says that no school district shall complete an annual teacher and principal evaluation, but there is currently a chapter amendment making its way through that would ease that a little bit and change the language from no school district shall complete to no school district shall be required to complete, which would give the districts the option to conduct APPRs should they choose to. What else? Oh, the chapter amendment also gives superintendents discretion to recommend or not recommend an individual for tenure alongside the caveats for not having the APPRs for the past couple of years. So that the chapter amendment is expected to move pretty quickly and pass. So that's where those stand right now, and I think that's it for me on school law.
Kristen, thank you so much. I just want to point out a couple of other things for our school district clients. First, the state released updated K through 12 guidance yesterday afternoon. So many of you were working off of the guidance that we received last year. The state finally decided to update that. It includes the new information about the masking requirements that went into effect yesterday. And it also includes formal discussion of the 3-foot social distance versus the 6-foot that was initially required. So for our school district clients, take a look at that new guidance that came out yesterday. It's in the same location as the old guidance. It's just been updated. And that location is on the state's New York Forward website. So with that, we will turn to Katie Anderson. Katie has a lot to talk about today, as she tells me every time before our weekly webinar. And today, one of the things I'm sure she's going to cover is the governor's press conference from yesterday and announcement. So Katie, take it away.
Yep, I always start my week on Monday morning by going, man, I don't know if I'm going to have anything to talk about at the webinar this week. And then always end up with about 50 minutes worth of material that I could talk about. So lucky me. Looking at what's happening in New York COVID-wise, great news, we're at the lowest positivity rate that we've seen throughout this entire pandemic. Again, just excellent news. I cannot overstate how wonderful that is to look at. Vaccination progress. So it's getting confusing. So the numbers that New York State is using are different than the numbers the CDC are using to determine who is vaccinated, who's received one dose. It's getting, it's a little tricky. I don't really understand why they're different, but these top two numbers, that's the CDC and the New York Times. And so it's all New Yorkers. It's everybody, age 0 up. 48% are fully vaccinated and 57% have one dose. But New York's numbers now say that 68.6% of all New Yorkers 18 and over have taken the first dose. Great news. And the state has projected that we will hit 70% of all adults with one shot in the next 8 days. So maybe by next week, I'll put some animation in the slideshow to celebrate that. Looking in terms of other demographic groups, a really phenomenal number. You're looking at New Yorkers 65 and older have an 84% vaccination rate, and then 12 to 17-year-olds, 32% have taken their first dose. So with all of those updates, we come to what the governor said yesterday. I wanted to include some of these headlines here because it was wildly misleading. If we could have the next slide, Kathy, thank you so much. So this is what was announced yesterday. New York is going to be lifting COVID restrictions when we reach 70% of everybody getting their first vaccine shot in New York. This is, as you can imagine, not fully the case, but let's go through what we know right now, right? We won't know until we know, but what do we know right now? General restrictions are going to be lifted, including our favorite thing, the health screening. Hopefully by next week, we can say goodbye to that forever. The reason that we still have to follow the health screening is because those office reopening guidances, or whichever one is applicable to your industry, those are still enforceable. And that's why the health screening has to continue. And that's why the state would have to affirmatively say, no longer have to do this. Looking at other things, the sanitation procedures, those will go away. Contact tracing information collection. If you're having visitors come into your facility, that goes away. But masks and social distancing still follow the same rules that we've been following for the past 3 weeks, right? Unvaccinated people still have to wear their masks. They still have to social distance. It doesn't look like any of those rules will be changing at any time soon. The restrictions for schools and public transit, large venues, events are likely going to all stay in place. Events, and restaurants, it's just going to be another confusing thing over the next 2 weeks to be taking a look at what rules will be applying, what rules won't be applying. So stay tuned. Hopefully I'll have more to tell you, more guidance to give you on this front by next week. But ultimately, again, the biggest thing is health screenings definitely will go away once we've reached 70% vaccination rate. And looking at, the rest of it, it's all kind of staying the same. So just, everybody take a big deep breath here. Not much will really be shifting. Oh, Canada. I get a lot of questions every week about the potential reopening of the Canadian border. We have good news. The potential, and this is all still highly, we don't necessarily know if this is going to be the case. Potential date for loosening the restrictions set to be June 22nd. This has not been officially announced at all by either the US or the Canadian government. But the agreement that currently closes the border between the two countries is set to expire on June 21st. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had previously said that Canada would be looking to loosen the restrictions on travel between the two countries when at least 75% of Canadians had received one dose. As of May 29th, so it's not as recent as we would like that data to be, but 68% of Canadians had received one dose. Canada is currently on track to reach 75% of Canadians with one dose by June 21st. As a result, it's very, it seems very promising that the border will be at least beginning to reopen. I don't know in what capacity. I don't know if it'll be, what it will look like, but it is likely. The Canadian government has really suggested that they will be checking to make sure that travelers are fully vaccinated at the border in order to enter the country, which is also what France is doing now as well, but we don't share a border with France. So stay tuned on that as well. Finally, I only included one brief slide on this, even though it's been dominating my life this week. The New York legislative session is scheduled to end on Thursday. It will likely end on Friday, like Friday morning. They'll do an all-nighter. A few bills to look at. One, the HERO Act chapter amendment did pass the Assembly and Senate. It passed the Assembly late last night. It still hasn't been sent to the governor for signature, but lucky for us, it passed. Remember, that's the July 4th date is coming. There's also the bill that would extend the statute of limitations for discriminatory practices in employment. It extends that statute of limitations from 3 years to 6 years. Passed the Senate. It is poised to pass in the Assembly. I would not be surprised if this bill passes. What the end of this legislative session, what's happening here is we're not seeing one big issue dominating the end of session like we have in years past. Instead, you're seeing a lot of smaller bills moving and passing that have the potential to have, a pretty big implications. So keep your eyes out for that, and I will let you know next week if that one passes. Additionally, there's a bill that would expand whistleblower protections. So it would include former employees and independent contractors in whistleblower protections. It's on third reading in both houses. What that means is it could be taken up at any time for debate and then an eventual vote in either house. So that means it's very close to passing as well. With that, Adam, I will kick it back to you.
Katie, thank you. A lot going on at the state level, and thank you as always for keeping us updated. As far as the HERO Act chapter amendments, do we have any idea, do we have a good idea of whether those are actually going to pass or not, or do we still not know?
No, it's just a question of when will the Senate and the Assembly send it to the governor for signature. You imagine that they will be sending lots of bills. They have lots of chapter amendments that they had to pass in the past, this week. They're just probably going to send a lot of them all at once. But we will continue to keep our eye on that to make sure that we know what's happening.
That's great. And we'll make sure to update all of you as soon as we know anything more on the HERO Act. So thank you so much. All right, next we're going to turn to Pete Jones, and this plays nicely off of what Katie was just talking about, and that is, what do you do with your reopening plans? Now that we have this information from the governor about potential changes, what's still good, what do we need to work on, et cetera. So Pete, take it away.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I just want to go perhaps a little deeper into some of the things that Katie touched upon. And I thought it would be helpful to maybe, take us back to where we were, kind of reset this a little bit, and then and delve into what's changed and what's stayed the same. So recall the reopening that the governor indicated that, we would use a phased approach to reopening the state, and that we issued industry-specific plans. What we learned pretty quickly was that there were a lot of common features to these plans. There were some nuances between industries and between phases, but for the most part, they all had the following elements. They had physical distancing requirements, that people be 6 feet apart if possible. If not, that there be masking and minimizing those interactions. 50% of maximum occupancy. That they had a protective equipment piece that required face coverings, limiting the sharing of objects, limiting touch areas, providing gloves, sanitizer, and hand washing recommendations. They had hygiene, cleaning, and disinfection provisions, requiring that you adhere to the CDC and DOH guidelines, and that there be regular cleaning and disinfection. There was a communication component, including the affirmation that you had the plans and signage, notice to the Department of Health of positive tests. And then there's screening, as Katie had alluded to just a minute ago, the mandatory screening requirements that remain in place today. So as we have moved forward, and Kathy, if you could go to the next slide, please. A fair amount has changed, outside of the reopening guidance. One thing is our knowledge of COVID, I believe, is increasing. This may be something that goes a little bit in fits and starts in terms of the developing science here, but obviously we're learning a lot about how this disease progresses and what the variants do, and so that may change and has changed. I think the thinking on some of the elements that are in reopening plans. Also having changed, obviously, is the vaccination rates. That's changing the calculus for us. The positivity rates, which are on the decline, which is, of course, great news. That we are moving into the outdoor season here, where the transmission of the disease is a lot less likely, as we saw last summer. People are outdoors, they're less congregating indoors. The fresh air is very helpful in terms of transmission. And then we've seen, I think, evolving CDC guidance. There was a period of time when, New York State was issuing guidance at a breakneck pace, and things seem to go a little bit slower on the federal level. I think that's flipped in recent months. We see a lot more out of the CDC, New York tending to react to that and lag that. So what does that mean? Kathy, if we can go to the next slide. So New York State, the key guidance here that we're focused on at the moment is the May 19 guidance document, where New York State adopted the CDC interim public health guidance for fully vaccinated people. That's a mouthful, but basically the quick summary is you do not have to. You're authorized to require masks and social distancing, or you can adhere to the so-called CDC guidance. And the summary of that guidance, at least from New York State's perspective, was that fully vaccinated individuals did not need to wear masks or be socially distanced. And unvaccinated individuals needed to continue that in workplace settings and in business settings. And as we've reported on in the past, and everyone's aware of this at this point, you could either require proof of vaccination status, or you could use the honor system to adhere to the CDC guidance. And I believe that implicitly in this guidance, there are also some backdoor provisions that address capacity limits that sort of suggest that if you can dedicate a space to vaccinated individuals, that you don't really have to adhere to the limitations because you're following CDC guidance. And that if you're not following that guidance, if you can meet the requirements of social distancing and masking, you may still be able to do something that would exceed 50% of maximum occupancy. At least that's implied from the guidance.
Pete, I don't mean to cut you off here, but I think you're touching on something that's important and worth following up on. In reviewing the questions that we were getting over the last couple of weeks, we've gotten several people who have asked about capacity limitations. So this is important. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that according to this May 19th guidance document, for offices, for example, if you have vaccinated individuals, they don't have to socially distance and they don't have to wear masks. And because they don't have to socially distance, there would be no capacity restriction for those individuals. Is that right?
Well, I think that's right, Adam. I mean, to me, what I'm about to say and what I am, saying here is that anything that isn't disturbed remains in effect. And we don't have, specific language saying this supersedes a prior guidance with respect to, either of these two elements. But I think it's a fair reading of the May 19th guidance to say that, yes, it explicitly says that you don't have to wear masks and you don't have to socially distance. So that must supersede what's in the reopening plans for everyone. And then there's also language in that May 19th document that talks about capacity limits. And I do think it's a fair reading. And I think you and I have talked a little bit about this generally, that it likely means that the capacity limits would not have to be adhered to if you're talking about a space that is dedicated to vaccinated individuals. And then, as I mentioned before, there is this language that also states that with respect to unvaccinated individuals, if you could adhere to the social distancing and the masking, then you really don't need to be as concerned about what the maximum occupancy is either. I'm working through in my mind what kind of a space that might actually be applicable to. Probably a very limited number of cases. But I think the principle that we're gleaning from this is that the second in time will supersede the first in time if it's clear. And at least on the first point, it's very clear. And on the second point, it appears to be the best reading at this point. So I think that's a fair statement, what you said. Let's move forward to the next slide, please, Kathy, because I want to just sort of see if I can tie it together. So, where are we with the reopening plans? I mean, the first key principle, and we've been saying this for months, almost a year in some cases now, as we come up on the original reopening from last June, is, follow your reopening plans. And do recall, please, that if you've followed the guidance, you've probably affirmed that you will follow your reopening plan and, put a certification in. So it's worth noting that we still need to follow those plans until, as Katie says, maybe something happens and they're no longer applicable. The second principle that I think I just want to point out to people is you should update your plan as needed. There have been some things that have changed. In the screening area, we've had changes. And now I think in the masking area, we have changes with respect to vaccinated individuals. That will also affect your signage. Signs that say that everyone must wear a mask and socially distance would not be applicable if you have elected to follow the CDC guidance, at least with respect to fully vaccinated individuals. So you would need to update your plans in some fashion to make sure that you've got, an up-to-date plan that follows the most recent guidance. So that would bring me to the first key question that I just wanted to mention to people is, so what has changed in each area? That's what you're looking at. Where's my plan still valid and compliant? And is there anything that must be updated or may be updated that will allow me to flex a little bit and reach a more, a better place for my workplace and for my business? The second key question then would be, what do we do when the plan appears to be outdated, but the guidance hasn't caught up? And I think our advice is you need to continue to follow the reopening plan guidance until we get guidance that supersedes it or revokes it. And so we have had questions from a lot of clients talking about, can we relax the cleaning or the disinfection, or, can we do some other things that are still in there? I think screening's been a very common one. And the short answer is those are still in place. And unless we've got something that explicitly or implicitly supersedes or amends your plans, it's our recommendation that you still follow them until we get to a point where the state changes those rules. As Katie mentions, that may happen, soon. Hopefully we'll get to a point where we get clarity around that as well, because a blanket revocation would be incredibly helpful. when they the guidance is piecemeal, taking a little piece or that piece, that's just going to kind of keep the complexity here, that which pieces are superseded and which remain in effect. So that's the quick summary on that, Adam.
Thanks, Pete. And thank you for that. So one of the questions that I'm seeing a lot in the chat today is, wait a second, the HERO Act just got signed into law, and it requires us as employers to have these plans, these safety plans. And now the governor's coming out and saying that when we hit 70%, some of these areas of our plans are going away. How do you reconcile those two things? And, you know, I don't have the answer to that. I think that's a very, very good question. The HERO Act requires the state to put out these template plans. A lot of you are asking if we have them yet. The answer is no. We're waiting to see what those template plans are going to include. You know, our thought all along was that those template plans were going to mirror what was included in the template plans from last summer. But, you know, we don't know because the governor's now saying that these precautions are going away. So I think there's a lot of information that we need to get from the state that we don't have yet. What we're hearing is that the template plan should be released by July 4th. But again, the state can do what it wants, and you know, we will make sure to update you as we get more information. All right, so what we're going to do next is some FAQs. I know Andy Bobrick called it the grab bag last week. That's fine. Call it what you will. But what we've done is gone through and taken a look at the most recent questions that we've been getting, both in emails from clients during this webinar. So what are the topics we're seeing the most, and try to give you some clarity and guidance on those. So the first topic I'm going to cover is travel. Some of you may have mastered this by now, but you know, it is pretty complex, so I'm going to cover it again. So first of all, what quarantines, furloughs, and testing are required for individuals who travel domestically and or internationally? So on April 10th, the state released its most recent iteration of the travel guidance. This more than any other area has undergone the most change over the past 10 months. And we finally saw what I think will hopefully be the last guidance documents on travel on April 10th. What the state is saying is that individuals who travel domestically do not have to quarantine, furlough, or get any enhanced testing. So that's the state's position on domestic travel. With respect to international travel, the state is taking the same position, that individuals who travel internationally do not need to furlough, do not need to quarantine, and do not need to test, with some exceptions for healthcare providers. I will point out a couple of things, however. The CDC is continuing to require a negative test for individuals entering the United States by air internationally. The test has to be within 3 days of when the person enters the United States by air. It applies to all individuals entering the United States, including those who are fully vaccinated. So if you think I'm going to travel internationally because I'm fully vaccinated and I don't have to comply with this 3-day testing requirement when I come back, that's wrong. According to the CDC, the tests are verified by the airline. So you're boarding a plane in England and you're trying to fly back to the United States. The airline carrier should verify your test status there before you get on the plane. All right, so that is the travel question. Now, another question we've been getting deals with payment for sickness after someone gets the vaccine. The governor caused a little bit of confusion ago when he came out at a press conference and said that if you get the vaccine and you get sick the next day, you're going to have paid leave. And he said it very affirmatively. And he said, we're going to put out guidance that explains. You know, we waited for the guidance. The guidance came out the next day or so. And the guidance didn't say what the governor said. What the guidance said was, you know, that paid sick leave law that we had enacted that went into effect on January 1st? Well, if somebody gets sick following the vaccine, that would be a qualifying event entitling them to the paid sick leave. Now, the problem with that guidance is that the paid sick leave law doesn't apply to all industries, or excuse me, all employers. It doesn't apply to public employers. And it also wouldn't apply if the individual hadn't accrued enough time to use under the paid sick leave law, or they didn't have any time available. So while the governor wanted to convey the message that employees would receive paid sick leave following the vaccine, he did so in a way that caused a lot of confusion for a lot of employees. So I wanted to clarify that point as well. A couple of other smaller questions that we've been getting a lot of. Do the social distancing relaxation guidelines apply to people who have had COVID? So Pete went through the May 19th guidance document that talked about masking and social distancing for those who have been vaccinated. Well, we've had employers ask us, well, what about our employees who've tested positive? Do those guidelines apply to them? And the answer is no. The guidelines very specifically only apply to those who are fully vaccinated. And finally, another question we've been seeing quite a bit is, how do we verify, or what's the best way to verify our employees' vaccination status? We know from the EEOC guidance that just came out last week that information regarding vaccination status is medical information that has to be maintained confidentially. So whatever method that you choose, whether you have your employees show you proof physically with paper in front of you, or have them email it, or any other digital method, you have to make sure that you maintain the information confidentially. So those are some of the most common questions we've been getting. Please continue to send in your questions and we'll continue to answer them. With that, I'm going to turn us to our last session of the day, or our last topic of the day, and that is Teresa Rusnick. You've seen Teresa on our webinars before many times. Teresa's going to provide us with an update on the EEOC guidance that just came out that I referenced. I will put in a little plug for Teresa. She wrote a blog post on our labor and employment blog that went through some of these issues, or the updated guidance. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that. And with that, Teresa, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Adam. Can I have the first slide, please, Kathy? Okay, so I took some of the questions like Adam did that Rebecca got last week when she talked about the EEOC guidance, and I also included some of the questions that I've been hearing a lot from different clients. So I'm going to use those questions as a way to tease out some of the things that the guidance has said. So one of the questions I've been getting a lot are, what are some examples of reasonable accommodations for people who are not vaccinated, be that for religious or medical reasons? Some examples could be the things that you've been doing all along, letting people work from home, having them wear masks, having them socially distance, cleaning the workplace in a different or more vigorous way. Those can all be examples of accommodations for people who aren't vaccinated and are in the workplace. And again, New York has guidance out right now saying if you're not vaccinated in the workplace, even if it's not for a religious or medical reason, you have to wear a face covering and maintain social distance. So you shouldn't have to think too far outside the box on that one. Questions have come up around employees who refuse to get the vaccine, or aren't willing to get the vaccine because they're pregnant. And the EEOC guidance does explicitly state that if you extend accommodations to other groups of people for religious or medical reasons, you have to extend them to people who are pregnant as well, who are unvaccinated. So please note that you do have a duty to accommodate them. What if a vaccinated employee tells the employer that he wants to stay home because he's immunocompromised and is still at greater than average risk to become seriously ill from COVID? The EEOC guidance specifically talks about this example when there's an employee who, is vaccinated, but is still saying, I feel like I'm at risk for COVID-19. You have to treat that as a request for an accommodation, just like you would any other request for an accommodation. You're entitled to medical documentation and to do the interactive process and undue hardship analysis with that employee. Just because they're vaccinated doesn't mean that you don't have to engage in the interactive process with them if they bring a concern like this to you. Now, you're entitled to the medical documentation, of course, and you can do your undue hardship analysis, but you can't dismiss it out of hand. Next slide, please. If a vaccinated employee comes into the office and is visibly sick, can the employer ask them to wear a mask? If anyone comes into your office and is visibly sick, you can ask them to go home. If you think that they're not able to do their job because they're sick, or they're going to get other people sick, you can ask them to go home. That's a safety issue in the workplace if they're visibly sick. But yes, of course, if you think that they're visibly sick and they need to stay in the workplace for some reason, you can ask them to wear their mask. Is an employee's vaccination card confidential medical information? Yes, it is. The EEOC guidance provides that the vaccination card or proof of vaccination, whatever it might be, doctor's note, whatever, is going to be treated as confidential medical information, which means for employers, it needs to be stored separately from the other information in the personnel file. Can an employer offer incentives to an employee for their employees' family members to get vaccinated if the vaccination site is on the employer's premises? No. There's a lot in the EEOC guidance, really for the first time, about employer incentives for vaccinations and how they work for the employee versus the employee's family members. And there's a distinction there between when the vaccinations are on site for the employer and when they're off site. So all of those things are important to consider when you're thinking about offering vaccination incentives. That's, if you are thinking about doing that, I urge you to reach out to counsel. That's going to be a little bit trickier of an area of law, especially because there's benefits and HIPAA involved with that as well. Not saying you can't do it. In fact, the EEOC says in certain circumstances you can. It's just something you want to be careful about implementing if you do go that route. Next slide, please. Is there a difference in accommodating employees who are not vaccinated for religious reasons versus a disability? Practically speaking, probably not. The undue hardship analysis is a little bit less rigorous for religious reasons than for disability reasons, but for practical purposes, the same accommodations are probably going to apply. The wearing of the mask, the social distancing, the working from home, those types of things are going to apply regardless of the reason that the person isn't vaccinated, be that religious or medical. When is it an undue hardship to have an unvaccinated employee in the workplace? The answer to that is when it poses a direct threat. And the direct threat analysis is a very fact-based one based on a number of different factors that are laid out in the EEOC guidance. I'm not going to go through them now. I don't have them memorized, but there are a number of different factors there, and that's going to be a very fact-intensive analysis. If you are an employer who's considering terminating, disciplining, or otherwise excluding unvaccinated employees, I urge you to reach out to counsel and make sure you're doing the direct threat analysis correctly, because even if you find out that someone is a direct threat, you still may have to accommodate them. So it's kind of a multi-step process there. And then finally, can an employer require that an employee submit medical documentation verifying that the employee cannot be vaccinated? Yes. If you have a mandatory vaccination policy and someone says, I can't be vaccinated because of a disability, you have the right to require documentation of that disability saying that they can't be vaccinated. And again, treat it confidentially. Okay, so Adam, those are some of the questions that I've gotten and some of the ones that I saw from last week on the EEOC guidance, or that incorporate the EEOC guidance.
Teresa, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. Here is our information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Please join us next week. We look forward to seeing you all then.